Hi, everybody. I'm Tara Bradley with The Growth State, and today I have with us Mads Singers. He's got a really varied background, and we're lucky to have him. He's got 10 plus years of experience in Fortune 500 companies, including Xerox and IBM. He's currently running 3 of his own companies, which have over 100 employees. So he's busy beyond that. So his expertise spans a lot of aspects of management, including growth and scale, which I know we're all really excited about and interested in. He is one of the leading experts on the DISC methodology. So looking forward to hearing more about that. And he does share his knowledge through the Effective Management Mastery course and community, which we'll ask him to share about as we wrap up. So Mads, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm anxious to chat with you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you guys. I always love sharing and helping people, so that's awesome.
Perfect. Well, I generally find that those people that enjoy helping people the most have had some sort of pain point where they're like, wow, that hurt. I don't want to do it again. And it hurt enough. I don't want other people to go through it too. And so they kind of go through that, and it comes out in consulting and just education. And what I was wondering if you could share with us what one of those pain points may have been for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably different than most people. I haven't really had like a huge pain point in the sense of, a lot of people have the story of I had $20 back and I had nothing to do and, life sucked. But I mean, my biggest pain point was really, I realized when I was very young, sort of early 18, that I wanted to be a manager, right? And my biggest pain point was really learning about it, right? Like it was really getting into it. I was absolutely not a fan of school. And when I realized I wanted to be a manager, I had no intention of spending 4 or 5 years going back to school and learning that way.
Right.
So basically my fundamental learning path was really through self-development and so on, right? And ever since that time, like even in large corporations like Xerox and IBM and many other big businesses that I've worked with, generally management training sucks, to put it politely.
Yeah.
In the sense that, so many times people are promoted from a typical role doing whatever they're doing into a management position. And there's literally zero support. Like there's zero training. They have a boss saying, hey, my door is open, ask me any questions. But, there's not, in most businesses, there's not a solid training program. There's not a solid sort of coaching for new managers, which is, in my opinion, such a big mistake, right? And this is exactly the same thing when you're talking with entrepreneurs, right? So many small business owners and founders, they start a business, they have some great people, they start promoting them into management role, and unfortunately, there's very little support typically around the management aspect. And that's really what I'm trying to deal with, because that was sort of the pain point I had when I was growing up in management, if you will. And that's really what I'm trying to address, right? So I love working with founders and their management team, really putting serious management skills into these people. And the whole thing about management, so many people come to me and says, oh, well, I'm not good at management, or management is hard. But most of the time, it's because they've never had good training. They've never had someone actually get to the basics of it. And like, I have a training as an example, which is like 5-6 hours, and it makes a world of difference, right? But it, like anything, if you're looking at it from the ground up, and it's like your first day in any business, everything looks scary, right? But most things, when you get a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of skill set, then it becomes significantly easier to grow. And even a little bit of knowledge makes a huge difference in your performance, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because management, I feel like, is definitely one of those things that you go to college to check the box, right? You go to school to do that, because nobody comes out of college being a great manager. They don't have the experience, and that doesn't automatically make them ready. And I think what's also interesting with founders, CEOs, is a lot of them jump right into their first business and they haven't led teams and they haven't managed people, and they're not automatically great at it. So they need that investment just as much as anybody else. I'm curious on your perspective, I'm sure you've found this, and I found this myself, that Not everybody is great at management. They're a great individual contributor. They throw them into management. Like you said, they don't get a ton of investment. There's no plan. Like there's no onboarding when you come into management. They just think that you know it. But there's also this paradigm where there's less and less feedback loops, right? Like there's less people giving them feedback and saying, no, don't do this, do that, or no, that was great, keep doing that. How do you account for that in your method?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing is exactly as you were saying, right? Like, there's a lot of these things around the best engineer doesn't make the best engineering manager, the best sales guy doesn't necessarily make the best sales manager. And honestly, that's not necessarily correct. They might not, like the best sales guy might not be the best sales manager the second he's promoted.
Right.
But if someone can teach themselves to bring themselves on top of the sales game, they can also, develop their management skills to be a really outstanding manager, right? That's my belief. And I mean, I've trained a lot of people and I've never had anyone where this is not the case, right?
Right.
There might be some people who have a little bit of management experience and might initially be a little bit better. But here's the thing. I mean, top performers, and a lot of entrepreneurs are those people, right? But just like when you look at it, if you're a top performer, if you can drive yourself to be a top performer in one area, you can often do it in other areas. And management is one of these great skills that I believe fundamentally that anyone that really wants to can learn to be a manager, right? The challenge is sometimes people look at the likes of Elon Musk or Steve Jobs and they're like, I have to be like them to be a great manager and a great boss. And that is not correct at all. In fact, if you're not like them and trying to be like them, you will definitely fail, right? But the great thing about management is a great manager requires so many skills, right? And the thing is, everyone have certain strengths and weaknesses around those skills. And no matter what your personality is, you will have certain strength around it. There's definitely things to learn, but there's things to learn for everyone, right? So anyone can learn to be a good manager if they really want to. Now, if you sit back and say, oh, I don't want to learn, well, you're not going to learn, right?
Right.
So
no, I definitely think that that resonates with me as well. The one thing that I find is interesting, though, sometimes with founder CEOs, and that's a lot of what our listeners are, and they're in that space, because they are so motivated and such high self-starters, they can get a little frustrated, with leadership and teams that they promote from within, and don't really recognize the investment that they have to make to up-level themselves and to up-level the team. Have you run into that too much? And how do you kind of get their mind wrapped around that?
right, here's the secret. Most of the time, founders are the one keeping the company down, right? Because here's the thing. When you're running around doing everything, what happens is in most cases, when you have staff that's not growing with the company, and when you're dealing with staff that isn't growing fast enough, it is usually back to the person managing them, right? So when the easiest way to grow people is giving them responsibility. And the easiest way to hinder people's growth is to not give them responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a team of people where you're feeling they're not growing fast enough, it is typically because of the way you manage them, right? So again, many founders have this idea of, they're working crazy hours, they're trying to do all the stuff instead of actually giving their staff responsibility and ownership, right?
Right.
And that's one of the biggest thing I work with most founders and CEOs on, right? Like a lot of the time, and it's often a switch, right? Like many of the guys I work with, like 3-6 months, they get huge benefit because these small things, they don't think about how it happens. But when you start talking through the logic of particularly delegation of responsibility and so on, when it works and how it works, it makes such a huge difference to your staff to be given responsibility rather than be given tasks. And particularly in the online world, there's so many gurus teaching, like, when you hire staff, you sit down, you draw out a process, you tell them exactly what to do. And the problem is that that's not how any of you founders learned.
Right.
And that's not how anyone else learns, right? So the problem is when you do that, you're basically creating robots. And while that can be beneficial to a certain extent, you don't want a company of robots. Like most of the business owners that aren't delegating well, right? Here's what happens. They work crazy hours. Two, they always give feedback like, oh, my staff never come up with ideas for improvements and things like that. And typically it's a scenario of, I don't feel my staff is developing and, they're not growing and so on. And they kind of feel, where they're here and the staff is here, they hope the staff would get up to their level. But actually what happens is the other thing, they're growing more than their staff. And that is typically, and it's very common in the tech world particularly, but typically that is a function of, I wouldn't say bad management, poor management, let's call it that, right? Where as a founder, as an owner, or even as a manager within an organization, you haven't learned to let go. You haven't learned to delegate and really give your team the right level of responsibility.
Sure. And, I definitely agree with that. And I've seen it over and over and over again, right? And you'll even have a conversation where they say, hey, you've got to trust them. And sometimes you even have to let them fail a little bit, but, they can learn through that process too. And I think I sometimes feel it's a trust issue. Do you feel like you run into that where it's like, they haven't really learned how to put their trust into somebody and, by default, then they're not really being trusted as a leader and a partner?
Right. So the question I always ask is, how did you learn? Right? Because, and this is for anyone who is a successful entrepreneur, the answer is the same. In most cases, they were in an organization, they were given trust, even if they had no skills and no knowledge, someone gave them trust. Mm-hmm. And that is the only way to learn, right? I'm not saying don't have processes. Processes are super useful, right? But it's the difference between handing over tasks to people and giving people responsibility. Now, here's the thing. No human being I ever met wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I want to go do a bad job today. Literally no one does. Right. No one. Right. So the thing is, like, I look at myself. If I have an employee that's not performing, it's generally my fault. Either I hired the wrong person for the wrong job, I haven't given them the right training and support, or alternatively, I'm not giving them enough ownership and authority. That's really the three things, right? Now, obviously, the hiring aspect is a little bit of a different aspect, right? But again, the ability to put the right people in the right seats is also very important.
That's a really, really interesting shift. And it goes into another question that I have, because I absolutely believe that too. The right people in the right seat is critical. And the timing, I think, is important too. In the scaling company, sometimes, you're hyper focused on getting the right team, because a lot of times you're going to be putting them in front of, somebody who's a pitch group, or, somebody that they're going to be talking through in a PE or a VC firm. And, it's so many times we see that they didn't really bother, putting any effort into who they hired. It was like, oh, my buddy from college, he needs a job and he'll work for cheap and we can do that. Or my brother, or, they are finding that they're at the spot. If they're going to scale, they probably have to swap out some talent. They may not have people, like, to your point, that want to learn that. From your perspective, what's better? Do you try to get into it with the team that's there and say, okay, let's really dig in and try to grow them and see if we can get them there? Or do you do some sort of evaluation process and say, these two are fine, but, maybe we need to look at retooling these couple of positions?
That's really, my focus is really about making sure it's the right personalities in the right jobs, right? Because the challenge is, if you put the wrong person in the wrong, that's not good, right? So if you have the right type of people in the right type of jobs, then it makes a ton of sense to keep pushing, right? However, sometimes, and this is obviously lack of experience and lack of skill in recruitment, particularly, or in understanding personalities, but naturally personalities have certain strengths and weaknesses, right? Mm-hmm. Some people are, born to look at data and numbers all day, every day. Some people are born to, be human connectors and consistently communicate with people, etc. And depending, like, you can put someone who needs to talk to people all the time, they can be a great person, if you will, but they can be put into a job that they will never perform at, right? And the challenge is, if you have that kind of individual in the wrong position, you have two choices. You can either if you have the space, you can move them to a job that actually fits their skill set. Alternatively, let them go. Right. So,
Right.
but that's really the evaluation that I tend to do initially with companies, and in terms of basically teach them how to look at the personalities and so on, and really then look at do they actually fit the roles they're in? Because a lot of the time when people are not performing, it's either not enough support from a management perspective, or it's the wrong person in the wrong job type thing.
Yeah, I definitely, I've seen that over and over. I can remember, I've been in a few of these scaling companies, and I've probably had the same conversation 10 times where I can say, you're a great resource and I can wish and want and hope for you. And I believe you can do this job, but if you don't love it and you don't want to do it and you're going to be miserable, you're never going to stay. So let's figure out where you can actually be. And I love the personality types, which brings me to my disc question. I guess my first disc question, which I probably should have asked earlier, is what is your disc profile?
So by nature, I'm very, very high C with a little bit of S in me. So
Okay.
just to give like a very brief overview for people, right? So DISC is basically, it's somewhat similar to Myers-Briggs, but basically it breaks down in 4 personality type, D, I, S, and C. And basically every individual have a primary and a secondary, and they're always adjacent, right? So you can be DI, ID, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And basically those 4 type, when you look at all the breakdowns they have, basically there's 16 different main types of people, right?
Right.
Similar to Myers-Briggs. Now, the thing about DISC is it's focused on behavior, and basically you can tell someone's personality by just looking at them for a short period of time, right? So the power of DISC is the fact that you don't need tests. Most of these personality things, they fall down in the fact that you need a test. And a
Right.
test is only as good as the person taking them, their honesty, and honestly, how well they know themselves. So often you have people doing some of these personality tests and they just don't know themselves very well.
Mm-hmm.
And they even if they try to answer what they think, it's often not, let's call it correct,
Right.
right? So the beautiful thing with DISC is that you actually only need to look at people and look at some simple behaviors like, what's the volume of their voice? How much do the person actually smile? Like small, simple behaviors. And literally, I mean, when I meet a new human being, within 30 seconds, I can generally tell them things about themselves that they don't know,
Sure.
right? And that's the power of this compared to any of the other segments, and that's really why I love using this. It's very, very quick when you're working with your employees. It's very quick when you learn it to be able to identify like what is the strength and weakness of this individual, what type of jobs will they naturally be good at, and what will they not be good at, right?
Right. And for those of our viewers, I know we've got a lot of founders, CEOs, and you guys probably have taken the Myers-Briggs or you've done that yourself, but you haven't gone out and gone as far as to assign it out to your team and to your company. And we find that it's something they invest in later. But the one thing that I found, at least about DISC, is it's a great way, and it doesn't have to be incredibly expensive at the beginning to get started, right? Like like to your point, there's not these hard tests, and it's not really involved. It can be, and sometimes I think it probably should be, depending on what kind of problems you got. But the one thing that I really found interesting with DISC is I got better at talking to people by understanding their style and how they were taking me. Because I was always one of those people that like, hey, here's my opinion and you feel free to disagree with me, right? And then after I got into DISC, I'm like, oh, well, they're never going to disagree with me because that's just not who they are. And I had to really adjust my style. And, I elevated, 5x easy within 30 days of just understanding those different personality types. Is that pretty typical of what you see and what people can expect if they really invest in DISC?
Yeah, I mean, typically my disc training is sort of 1 to 2 hours. So I have about, in the course, I probably have about an hour and a half worth of disc training, right, which goes through all of it. And typically, again, like, so the key things to learn it's get to know yourself better, so your own strengths and weaknesses, and then it's people who are very different from you. That's the ones that makes the biggest difference. Because like if people are like you and they communicate like you, then you don't have a problem with it.
Right.
The people you tend to struggle to communicate with is people who are very different from you. And everyone once in a while have this experience like, why would anyone do that? Right. And you're baffled. You can't figure out why someone would do something like that, because to you it makes no sense. But here's the thing, to someone else it makes sense, because the way they think, the way they operate is different. And when you start to be able to understand what perspective they're operating from and understand that, then you can much better make sense of why they do what they do. Right. Now,
Right.
at the same time, everyone have had this experience where they're like, they meet a new person, they walk away and they're like, I didn't like that person. I don't really know why. I can't put a finger on it, but I just
Right.
didn't like the person. And often it's just because they communicate very differently than you do, right? So
Right.
actually learning that through this, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And I like that too. And one of the things that I found through that process, like you said, getting to know others, I felt like I became a better hiring manager because I understood the value of someone who was different than I was and thought differently. I'm a very quick thinker. I make quick decisions. And when I've made a decision, like it's gone, like I don't even remember it anymore. And I had a leader, I remember one time I was really struggling with her. Like every time we would have a meeting, she wouldn't say much other than she didn't want to do whatever we were doing. But then about 3 days later, she'd come back and say, I thought about that. And here's my thoughts on it. It would be very well laid out. And we went through the DISC process and I was like, I now get what's going on. I'm not giving her enough time to process. If I would do that, we got that figured out, and she was absolutely one of the best resources I had on my team, but I had to behave completely differently. And when I learned that, then I started hiring better people and getting through that process. How do you use DISC in hiring? Do you just kind of train people and say you bring them in and do DISC after? Do you ever pre-evaluate people in a DISC profile when you're hiring?
And no, we never do the test. It's just educating your recruitment team
Right.
on this, so they actually can just read people.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it, right?
Right.
We don't need the test. And again, you're more likely to make mistakes with the test, right? Just
Right.
as I said, because
Exactly.
particularly in an interview situation, right? If you have a job role that says you have to be very organized, and even if someone is not, if they take a DISC test that says, are you organized? Or like, how organized are you? They will say the maximum, even if they're
Right.
not, right? So particularly in an interview situation is where I find this any test to be most inaccurate, just because people obviously want to get the job, else they wouldn't be there in the first place, right?
Right.
So it's also where they're either overvaluing some of their own skills or
Right.
personality, or they're maybe being slightly dishonest, right? And I don't blame them. So
Right. Right. Yeah, or they have a blind spot, right? Like they think they're great at it and then they see someone who really is and like, wow, I'm really not that not that good at that thing. I would imagine that this comes into, I know you do a lot of work with, teaching leaders and founder CEOs and that type of people to delegate and really get in the right mindset of delegation. And I have to imagine this is very helpful in that, in understanding what to delegate to the right people and how to do it.
yeah, and really about understanding your own strength and your mindset around delegation, because people look at delegation in many ways, right? So like yourself, you would naturally be a good delegator because you're very, very action focused, right? But on the other hand, your challenge is often impatience, right? So if you're giving something to someone who's different than you would sometimes be impatient with them getting to the right result, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Um, do you feel like people, when they have a weakness, and sometimes I think it's hard to admit our our own weakness, right? Are they quicker to find that in others? Are they quicker to identify those things in others, or is it really the people that are different from them?
I would say, a lot of people I work with, they tend to seem to be very aware. Like they often start laughing and like, oh, that's me, right? I always make that mistake, or I always do that. So again, it's a little bit the personality type. Like someone like yourself would typically be not be as afraid of admitting a weakness, whereas you have other personality type that would either say it in their head but not say it out loud, or even trying to deny it to themselves, right? But it depends on the personality type more than anything, really.
Right. Oh yes, I have many weaknesses. I'm not afraid to share them with anyone. They know it, then they can handle it. I don't have to do it.
We are all full of weaknesses, just as
Yes.
we're full of strengths.
Yes.
So
I know we don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to get your perspective on how these principles, this is always really helpful when you're scaling because you're trying to bring on teams quickly. You're trying to get them, super effective quickly. But we're in a really weird spot right now, right? Because we're all remote. Some people are looking more to outsourcing. How have you adjusted to that, or you adjusted your message to people to say, okay, you can't get them in a room. You can't do all the things, the touchy-feely things that we used to do to get to know people and really work with them one-on-one. And, we're not whiteboarding anymore. How have you adjusted to that and kind of taught your community to do the same?
I mean, honestly, management is the same whether you work remote or not. However, bad management become significantly more obvious when you work remote.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a bad manager, you can sort of compensate that with physically being next to people, right? So a lot of the time, if you're a good manager, though, you basically you won't see too much difference between remote and physical, right?
Right.
And again, most of the clients I work with, like I've worked a lot with online business owners that have remote teams, right? So a lot of my clients are used to it. But I've also, particularly here in the beginning of Corona, I've worked with a lot of businesses helping them to, go remote. And there's definitely things you need to think about a little bit more when you're remote versus when you're physically there. But honestly, in the end of the day, the biggest challenge tend to be around certain personality types and making sure they have the right motivation and just making sure they have the right self-drive. Because one key thing is, if you're sitting working from home and you have never done it before, it requires a certain amount of discipline, right? So it's actually more like a personality type thing rather than necessarily a manager type thing. But you definitely need to be aware of your different people and their personality, so who you maybe need to check in with a little bit more, and who you need. Like, some people would be comfortable with a 1 week goal, whereas some people would be like, oh, well, I have a week to do it. Let me wait till Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
So you need to be a little bit. You need to know your staff to know kind of who to do what with, right? And how to manage them.
Right. Yeah. So your good managers are really going to leverage those personality types that they're probably already doing anyway, but the bad ones is just going to amplify how bad they really are.
And honestly, what I've seen at this moment is that, this remote thing, it opens up so many doors, because so many businesses before have been like, oh, we can only hire locally, but there's so much more opportunity now that that a lot of businesses have grown really fast since going remote, because suddenly they can hire people at a much more, like, if you were located in like LA or San Francisco, and now you're suddenly like, oh, well, I can hire people in Kansas or in Iowa or wherever, you suddenly get significantly better quality at a lower cost, which for a lot of businesses is eye-opening, right? And a lot of businesses have been telling themselves, we have to have an office, we have to look at our people. And for some, there's also some ego in it, right? Being able to say, oh, I have an office with, blah, blah, blah. But realistically, a lot of companies right now that are not hit particularly by Corona are growing really fast, because they've been able to recruit differently and get better skill at a better cost, right?
Right. Yeah, I really do think that, the whole ecosystem of the workforce is going to change, right? You're going to have, some people are going to have more access to better talent than they've ever had before. Some people are going to be moving to places where they don't have to demand such a high price and, really get some flexibility. So I'm anxious to see how that plays out and how people find those people. And I'm sure you and I could spend a whole nother 2 hours on that topic, and I'd love to do it at some point, but I don't want to take up too much more of your time. If people want to work with you or want to get more of your information, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah. mattsingers.com is my website, where I focus. It's all about management, right? So I have actually a free training people can join as soon as they open the website. But then my biggest coaching program is called the Effective Management Mastery. And that's basically where I go through sort of what I call the 80-20 of management, right? And as I said, it's about 5 hours worth of training, and it's very, very powerful for business owners, right?
Perfect, perfect. And there's a community tied with that as well. Do I understand that right?
Yes. Yeah, so that's a close community in the back end of that with people who have all been through the training and so on and so forth. So
Perfect, perfect. Well, Mads, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to chatting with you again.